everybody, and welcome to our lesson on Uphill 101. With me today, I have Rich from Trail Hero, and we're gonna go over kind of the tips and tricks of what you wanna keep in mind when you're trying to get a vehicle uphill. And first things first, if I'm correct, is building your plan and then sticking to it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You're trying to get this vehicle up this pretty big hill. You've got various different terrain. Maybe it's loose rock, maybe it's sand, maybe it's rock, slabs, all of that combined, and you're gonna have different driving styles to get up that terrain. Now, to do that, the first thing you should do is build your plan. So you're gonna figure out where your tires go. You're gonna communicate that even with your spotter, if you have one, or with your co-pilot, and you're gonna try to figure out how to get your vehicle up that obstacle.
From point A to point B.
Right. And then the big thing is to execute that plan. So you come up with the plan, and then now you gotta put it to use, right?
So, and I would imagine that one of the things you'll probably want to do at the beginning is walking that trail, walking that uphill and figuring out where you need to go and finding your line.
Yeah, exactly. So when you walk the trail, you need to look at obstructions where there might be loose rock, where you might lose traction. Obstructions big enough to where it might pivot the vehicle. If it does, how are you going to combat that with the steering to make sure the vehicle goes straight? These are all things to think about as you're trying to make your ascent up a hill.
Which is awesome. And again, if you have a spotter, obviously you definitely want to find a reliable spotter, because as your vehicle is going uphill, your vision and your view of the ground in front of you is going to be extremely limited, especially as that incline becomes steeper and steeper.
So one thing to think about as you're walking your path and planning your route is to figure out spatial awareness. How big is your vehicle? How does it fit on the trail? At that point, you can look at, okay, this tire, your driver's side front tire is going to hit this rock. At the same time, your passenger rear tire is going to hit another rock, forcing your vehicle one way or the other. And how are you going to steer to get past that?
Okay, and then from there, we discussed how different types of terrain is greatly going to affect how you might try to tackle that climb.
Yeah, so maybe when you're in loose rock, you're going to have an easier, lower throttle, but consistent all the way through, versus sand, you're going to try to carry more momentum and have a higher wheel speed so that you make sure you get to the crest.
Now, would sand kind of be similar to what you might want to do in snow as well?
No, actually. Snow is a completely different driving characteristic. You're going to have to feel the vehicle more, because with snow, you slide around a lot more than you do with sand.
And I know lockers can be really tricky in snow, where typically you'd think rocks and stuff like that, you want your lockers engaged because you want to grab more traction as you're climbing uphill. And snow lockers can be tricky because locking your tires when climbing, you can actually force your vehicle to crab walk
and slide off your
line. In a totally sideways direction, not the direction you want to go.
Right.
So lockers on the rocks, however, are useful, of course.
Yeah, you're able to stick your line and not slide off your line as much if you've got your lockers on. However, in like a loose rock hill climb, you want to have your lockers on. You want to be easy into the throttle, and it's not much of a crawl, and it's not a mat the gas and bomb up it.
Just a happy, steady pace.
Yeah, I would say it's about a 30-35% throttle. And at the same time you're doing that, whether you have lockers or not, you want to have the brakes applied with your left foot, right?
So we should be left foot braking easy.
Yeah.
And what's the purpose of that?
So the big purpose is with and without lockers, it's control the vehicle, control the drivetrain. If you don't have brakes applied, you don't have a strain on the drivetrain, which actually means you get drivetrain shock. So every time you hit something, the vehicle can bounce back, and then you put load and shock on the drivetrain.
So heavier risk of breaking stuff, or sliding off your line, bouncing off your line, or getting into a more precarious situation.
Yeah, and when you're doing these climbs, if full stop, all the way on the brakes is 100% of the brakes, you really only need about 5 to 10% of the brakes, just enough to kind of just slow things down a little bit and control your drivetrain.
Give you a little more throttle control there.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so that's more for, let's say, loose gravel and rocks.
Yes.
Now, in the case of sand, we're wanting a lot more momentum.
Yeah, so and it's a smoother transition, so you really don't need to be on the brakes until you get to the crest. You want to carry your momentum from the bottom all the way to the top, and then once you get to the top, you want to turn driver or passenger so you can see down below, because all these sand dunes have a trough and a crest, right?
Okay.
So once you get to the top, you want to turn, look at any obstructions, and then make your route down.
And then make your route down.
And so you really generally don't hit the brakes until you've turned sideways so that you can look and see what's going on.
Okay. And then again, snows can be really tricky. That's one of those you sort of have to feel it out.
Yeah, sometimes it's better to not hit the brakes at all and just let the vehicle track. Because if you hit the brakes, you could slide off the road.
And that's the important thing to remember when it comes to snow or really slippery, icy situations, or sometimes honestly even mud, is sudden movements when you have such a slick surface can upset the vehicle just enough to make really dire situations.
Yeah, it could take a bad situation and make it much worse.
Absolutely.
So when you're dealing with slick situations, it's on and off the throttle. It's not on and off the brakes, it's on and off the throttle. So you're trying to push the vehicle where you need to, but still track accordingly.
Sounds good. So now what we're gonna do is we're actually going to demonstrate with Rich here what it might look like and the methods you might use climbing up a sort of loose rock and dirt uphill. And then from there, we'll also show you what it might look like when you're climbing a sand hill, correct?
And then from there, maybe even a rock hill.
Maybe even a rock hill. Now, the important thing to remember though through all of this is always to build your plan of attack and then follow through with it. Make sure you know what you're doing ahead of time. That way your mind is in focus and in the game as you're doing the hill.
Okay, so the first thing you do when you pull up to a hill is to make sure that you build a plan to execute climbing the hill. First thing that we see as detours, we want to make sure we don't get into the ditch on the left-hand side. Additionally, there's multiple rock outcroppings on the left-hand side as well. Hitting the rock outcroppings with the rear tire could actually force the front tire into the ditch. And so we want to try to avoid those rocks as much as possible, but they're imminent, you're gonna hit them. And so looking at this hill, when we get to the point where we're gonna hit them, we're gonna use a little momentum to get the rear end up and over them, and we'll just avoid hitting them with the front end. We're in second gear, locked front and rear, and we just use a little bit momentum. And you can feel the car kind of hit some of these rocks, and you're high siding, meaning you're putting your tires on the rocks, but you want to make sure that you carry your momentum over so that the front or rear doesn't slide into a odd spot. Now that you're past those, you can kind of at this point in the trail, we're going to look at the next part, plan it out. There's some pretty good rock outcroppings, and we'll have to pick our way through it. So we have to avoid this rock here, but we know that the passenger side rear has this fairly large boulder. As we come in, the front passenger tire will climb it, and that'll kind of give us an indication of where it is. As soon as the front passenger passes this rock here, we want to carry momentum up and over this. This is going to basically chalk the rear tire, and if we don't carry momentum up over this rock, the front end will slide down. That's one thing we kind of want to avoid. It will happen a little bit, but we don't want it to swing all the way through. So a little momentum will help us get up and over this. We're going to take the left line, and even though it looks to be the worst and it puts you on the edge, it is also the smoothest. And so there's the front tire on that rock. We'll use a little momentum on the rear tire. You feel the front end pull around a little bit, but that momentum for the rear gets the tire up and over the rock, and we're able to keep moving forward. And you just kind of map out as you're driving what you think the vehicle is going to do. But the one thing to consider is just using consistent throttle, and your feet, you're driving with both feet, 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the gas, to kind of keep the vehicle from the drivetrain from shocking and loading and doing funky or weird stuff as you're driving. So just kind of drive through the brake. You're only about, maybe if full stop was 100% on the brakes, you're only at about 5 to 10% on the brakes. It's just enough to have some resistance on the drivetrain. So the main thing to understand when you're driving the dunes is to keep your speed going. Momentum's the key. And so as you go to climb and drop off dunes, you kind of want to maintain a certain speed. Here at Sand Hollow, the sand is really fine, and so you'll want to maintain a speed of about 15 to 20 miles an hour, however you decide to do that. Now, for the bigger dunes, you carry your momentum all the way to the top, and when you get to the top, you need to turn to the side. Don't continue straight up and over. So you get to the top, you make your turn, and you try to keep the front end from chattering, and you make your turn because you want to look down and see what's next. Here we have rocks, and so it's very important that you eventually turn downhill, straighten the vehicle out, and then you come to a slower speed so that when you hit the rocks, you're not doing any damage to your vehicle. But the idea is that before you go up and over, you're able to actually identify other obstructions, because a lot of times when you're driving in the sand, you don't get a chance to stop and look at the route ahead of you. You just gotta get a chance to drive it and kind of ad-lib it as you go. So again, as you climb, you want to maintain momentum, and when you get to the top, start letting off the throttle just a hair so that you can make your turn without chattering the suspension too much. That chatter in the suspension will create a strain on your vehicle. And so you get to the top. Oh, and now if you're stuck just like this is a bad spot. You can't continue forward. The goal is to turn in reverse and actually turn downhill. And it feels scary and the front end wants to come down more, but you turn downhill and then you slam on the gas and straighten her out. And once you straighten her out, bring her on down nice and slow. Other than that, man, it's, driving in the sand is simple. Just maintain your momentum and identify the objects as you're driving. All right, right now we're at the uphill rock climb, and the old idea is to make sure that you plan your route and then you work that plan. And looking at our route right now, you see tire marks, but you also see struggle. You can see that struggle with the black marks on the rock here. Some things that we look at is this dip right here. It's essentially a hole that if your tire gets into with the uphill over here, it will pitch your vehicle. So you're gonna wanna try to avoid this or straddle it if you feel confident in your spatial awareness. As you come through, you now have a ledge here, and you'll need to make sure that once the front end is up and over, you use a little momentum to get the back end up. And if you look real hard at the rock, there's a couple scrape marks. Those are identifiers, indicators as to that's a possibility of getting hung up, and we want to make sure that we don't. So we're going to use momentum to get up that and then proceed on to the rest of the route. We're on the uphill climb for the rocks. I'm in 4-wheel drive. I've shifted into manual mode in first gear to begin with. And as we make our climb, we will shift into second at a certain point, and I'll let you know when that is. I also have both lockers on. As we start to make our climb, we're straddling the crack that we showed you earlier. And now the front end is climbing up on the rocks, and we've hit the ledge. Now that our front's over the ledge, we're going to use a little momentum, so we'll shift into second gear, raise your RPMs, and make a bump. Just like that. Now we'll shift back into first, and 30-degree climb. It's pretty cool. Our roll pitch was about 7 degrees, but to be honest, when we're climbing and doing these things, I've never really looked at that gauge. The crazy part about this is you can't really see, so planning out your trip is very important. Your route, in understanding where everything was, not forgetting what was in front of you, is going to be vital, because you on this obstacle are about 1.5 to 2 foot away from a huge drop off, and if you falter and you forget where you're going, it could be very dangerous.
Now remember, the most important thing, no matter what the terrain looks like, is to have a plan of attack and to follow through with that plan of attack. Whether that means walking the trail, looking at obstacles, having a spotter, or anything in between, correct?
Yep, you build a plan, then you execute the plan.
And with that, we hope to see you guys out on the trail.